Greetings. This episode relates the struggle to control Florida by the French and the Spanish. After the English arrested Jean Ribault in England, his second in command, René Goulon de Laudonnière, assembled a force of about 300 settlers for Florida in early 1864 to found a colony. Jean Ribault lived from 1520 through October the 12th, 1565. A native of Dieppe, France, on the English Channel, Ribault entered the French Navy when a young man. He served under French Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. Both de Coligny and Ribault were in Huguenots, and men sought a place where their people could worship freely. The Huguenots were French Protestants who followed the teachings of theologian John Calvin. Calvin arose during the Protestant Revolution that lasted from 1517 until 1648. The Huguenots during the mid-16th century reached their peak population. The numbers reached about 2 million, about one-eighth of France's population. The central and southern portions of France contained their largest concentration. The majority Catholics distrusted the Huguenots and subjected them to constant persecution. Admiral de Coligny gave Ribault the secret mission of exploring North America. He was to establish a colony. He sailed from France with 2 ships and 150 French Huguenot soldiers. They reached Florida and the Jacksonville area and settled on the St. Johns River on May the 1st, 1562. From Florida, the expedition sailed north, reaching Port Royal Sound. Ribault left 28 men on Paris Island at a small fort they named Charles Fort. He returned to France on June the 11th, 1562, to get more men and supplies. The religious war that broke out in France between the Catholics and the Huguenots during his absence. This war forced him to flee to England, where he lobbied Queen Elizabeth I to fund a return voyage. Instead of funding a voyage, she had him arrested as a spy and imprisoned him in the Tower of London. René Goulon de Laudonnière lived from 1521, about 1529, until 1574. A native of Poitou, France, historians are uncertain of his family or other aspects of his early life. He received appointment as Ribault's second in command on his 1662 expedition to South Carolina. In early 1564, French King Charles IX bestowed 50,000 crowns on him to establish a colony. He sailed from France with 300 colonists aboard 3 ships. The fleet arrived at the mouth of the May River, which is now the St. Johns River, and sailed upstream to a favorable spot on June the 22nd, 1564, when Laudonnière founded Fort Caroline. The French had arrived in Florida to compete with the Spanish. To counter the French threat to their Florida claims, Spanish Admiral Pedro Menendez de Aviles landed with approximately 1,500 settlers and soldiers on Matanzas Bay shoreline. He named the new settlement San Augustine. His intention was to build a fort and then to destroy the French fort at Fort Caroline. His fort, 30 miles to the north, threatened the Spanish claims to Florida made by Juan Ponce de Leon in 1513. Thus began the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in the continental United States. Pedro Mendez de Aviles lived from February the 15th, 1519 through September the 17th, 1574. He was a native of Asturias, Spain, Azilius, and a scion of the old Spanish noble family. His parents, Juan Alfonso Sanchez de Aviles and Maria Alonso y Mendez de Arango, had 20 children. Pedro was one of the younger sons. His father died while Pedro was a young boy, and his mother remarried. She sent him to live with a guardian with whom the boy soon developed disagreements. Pedro ran away. Researchers discovered him 6 months later and returned him. Soon after, he joined the Spanish Navy. While serving, he saw service in an armada that sent against the French during one of the numerous wars those two nations fought. After the war, he returned to Asturias and used a small inheritance from his father to build a small ship. He persuaded some of his relatives to set sail with a quest for adventure. He quickly found it, engaging 3 French corsairs that attacked some Spanish ships. He captured 2 of the ships and drove the 3rd off. These and other exploits soon attracted the attention of Spanish King Philip II. Aviles served the king in several successful missions and became a court favorite. In 1564, the French established a fort in northern Florida that named Fort Caroline. The Spanish king, became alarmed when he heard this news. The fort threatened Spanish claims to Florida. It could also serve as a base of operations against Spanish treasure ships. Coming from the New World. He appointed Avilés as adelantado of La Florida and promised him a large land grant and title of Marquis if he succeeded in his mission. Avilés was to set sail for Florida and establish a fort as quickly as possible. When his forces were secure, he was to move against the French at Fort Caroline and destroy it. Completion of this mission would eliminate the French threat and secure Florida as a Spanish possession. Avilés set about preparing for the mission and soon set sail for Florida. The king also promised Avilés a governorship of Florida if he completed the mission. Avilés' fleet reached the waters of Florida in late August. He engaged a French fleet carrying supplies of reinforcements to Fort Caroline. This engagement had few results and the fleets broke off. On St. Augustine Day, August the 28th, 1565, Avilés sighted land and entered Matanzas Bay. Ponce de Leon had probably explored this area in 1513, but Avilés knew little about it. They spent a few days exploring, then settled on a site near an old village of Temiqua tribe. It was an easy to defend site with an artesian well that served as a fresh supply of water. After choosing a site for the fort, the people of the expedition went to work building a stockade. Archaeologists have found evidence of this fort in the Fountain of Youth Archaeological Park. Avilés named the settlement San Augustine in honor of saint on whose day he had sighted land. This fort was soon completed, and Avilés now was ready for the second part of his task. The French settlement at Fort Caroline had subsisted for about a year on short rations. Many of the soldiers stationed there mutinied. In despair, Laudonnière prepared to abandon the colony. The English at length released Ribault from prison, and he returned to France to organize a relief expedition to Fort Caroline. During the summer of 1565, he organized this relief expedition and departed France. He arrived off the coast of Florida on September the 28th, 1565, with 5 ships and 800 new colonists. He assumed command of the fort and prepared to resist the Spanish. Spanish Admiral Pedro Mendez de Avilés had accomplished the first part of his mission by establishing a fort at St. Augustine, and on September the 8th, the second part of his mission, to destroy the French Fort Caroline, several days' march to the north. He embarked as soon as the new settlement was established. On September the 16th, Menendez began assembling his assault force. A severe storm had blown up, packing heavy winds and rains. Menendez knew that the French fleet was near, buffeted by the same storm that pummeled his new settlement. He surmised that the French commander, Jean Ribault, would have to bring most of his force with him on that fleet, since its intention was to clearly attack the new Spanish fort. Menendez gathered a force of 500 men. On September the 17th, the expedition set off towards Fort Caroline. The heavy rains from the storms had inundated the countryside. The ground was soaked, and the soldiers had to cross rain-swollen streams. For 3 days they struggled through heavy, wet forest. After fighting their way through the difficult rain-soaked terrain, the force reached within a short distance of Fort Caroline on September the 19th. Menendez ordered that no fires be lit by the wet, hungry troops for fear that the French in the fort would detect their presence. On the evening of September the 19th, the French had no inkling of the Spanish force that waited in the forest just beyond the fort's walls. His force reduced to about 240 defenders after Renault's departure with the fleet. The weakened fort was not ready for any determined Spanish attack, but the idea of a force coming overland in the marshy terrain in a storm like they were having was unthinkable. After setting the sentinels, the French commander had went to bed. Near dawn, he arose. The rain still fell and the sentries were miserable. He relieved them and went back to bed. The Spanish garrison slept. At dawn, Menendez prepared his attack. The fort was situated on a point of land surrounded by swampy water. Led by a bound French prisoner the Spanish had captured earlier, the force made its way through the marshy ground to the fort. After a brief skirmish with some early rising French troops, the Spanish swept into the fort. Most of the French were still in bed. Many rose, half dressed or naked, to defend themselves. The Spaniards killed most of the defenders, but some managed to escape. When the battle ended, Menendez slaughtered most of the male survivors, sparing the women and children. Most of these were later killed. Some of the French managed to escape the carnage. Some of these were rescued by Renault's fleet. Others managed to find their way to Matanzas Inlet, where the Spanish slaughtered them a few days later. About 127 on the fleet of the French on the fleet had survived the hurricane and washed up near Matanzas at Inlet, about 15 miles north of St. Augustine and near the current day Cape Canaveral. The inlet blocked their attempts to walk back to Fort Caroline. Avies heard of their plight and made preparations to find them. He arrived at the site undetected with about 40 soldiers. After concealing his men in the brush around the stranded Frenchmen, he approached them to parley. He informed them that he had taken Fort Caroline and convinced them to surrender. He misled them into thinking that he would treat them well. Renault surrendered his men. The Spanish took the French 10 at a time to a nearby sand dune where they were out of sight and earshot of the other prisoners. Avies gave them the choice, converting to Catholicism or execution. Most of these French were Protestants and thus refused. Avies had his soldiers knife them to death. This routine continued until he had executed 111 of them. He would execute the remainder, including Renault, on October the 12th. The next episode relates the voyage of Sir Francis Drake as he circumnavigated the globe. Find out more about colonial history of the United States by purchasing the book Colonial American History Stories 1215 through 1664. The book is a timeline of events from Christopher Columbus to 1664. It is part of a larger series of 12 books, the Timeline of United States History series. The history at this time takes the reader up to the opening year of the Revolutionary War, 1775. I am currently writing 1776. You can find the books on my website, www.mossyfeetbooks.com. There are links to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Google Play, and other online booksellers. You may choose to purchase the book in ebooks or softbound versions. An audiobook version is available on Google Play. At the conclusion of this series, I will compile the episodes into an audiobook. The audiobook will be available on Audible, Amazon, Apple, Barnes & Noble, as well as many other audiobook sellers. You can find this podcast on Apple, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, TuneIn, and many other podcast platforms. I publish a video version on YouTube and Rumble. You can also order the books directly from me, the author, on the webpage. If you wish me to sign the book, to send an email to mossyfeetbooks@gmail.com requesting a signed book and instructions on how you want me to address it. Note, if you send me an email, I will add you to my contact list. Readers on the list will receive an email from me announcing when I publish a new book. If you do not want me to add you to the list, tell me and I will not add you. Listeners to this podcast that want email notifications of my releases can just send me an email requesting addition to the list. You can choose to have your name removed at any time. If you browse the website, you will find dozens of sample chapters, one for each of my books. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and thank you for listening.